Well, good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Good, good. I've got a question as we start this morning. Have you ever seen something that really bothered you? Now, I'm not talking about if somebody cut you off in traffic or if you've waited 45 minutes in line at Starbucks and the person in front of you still gets up there and they don't know what they want. How do you not know what you want? You've been in line for 40 minutes. Don't get up there and be like, what's a latte? It's milk and coffee, people. Just order it. I'm sorry, I'm venting. I've got patience issues. Maybe that happened to me. I'm sorry. It's healing for me to get this off of my chest. No, when I talk about things that bother you, I'm talking about something that really bothers you. Something that when you see it, you take it personal. Something that seems to impact you deep down at the core of who you are. I'm talking about things like injustice, hunger, poverty, abuse, bullying, teen pregnancy, suicide, addiction issues, stuff you see it, and maybe it hit close to home, it's affected a friend, it's affected a family member, somebody you go to church with, and you see it, and it just messes with you. And when you see it, you think, man, I feel like I need to do something with that. My kids and I went and saw recently the new Lion King movie that came out, and I don't know if you are a Lion King fan, I absolutely love that movie, but in it there's a scene where Pumbaa, and you guys remember who Pumbaa is, right? He's the warthog, and Pumbaa is kind of cornered by a bunch of the hyenas, and the hyenas are now body-shaming Pumbaa, and they're calling him a little bit on the plus side of being a warthog, and he says something great to the hyenas. He says back to them as they're body-shaming him, he says, "I may run from hyenas, but I don't run from a bully." And it's like this flip, or the switch gets flipped, and he just chases after him. He goes mad, and he just beats up all the hyenas, and they run away scared. And it's this amazing scene. And Luke, my 5-year-old, he will walk around the house now, and periodically he'll just walk up to me and say, "I may run from hyenas, but I don't run from a bully." And then he just turns around and walks away. I'm like, okay, so for whatever which reason, that line from the movie has stuck with my 5-year-old Luke. But there's this part of me that loves that line has stuck with him, and here's why. When he sees an injustice, when he sees pain in this world, when he sees something that doesn't sit right with him, I hope and I pray that my kids are the type of kids who don't run away from problems, but rather they run towards them. And so when you see something that bothers you, when you see something that just messes with you, what do you do with that? Do you run away from it? Or are you the type of person that runs towards it? Now, it seems like in today's day and age, what we tend to do is run to social media, right? And we think if we just write a blog post or tweet something or retweet something or put a picture on Facebook, we feel like we've actually done something to change the world, right? By putting it out there on social media. Our team actually found this funny video that shows how culture believes that social media and posting things on social media can actually be blurred with actually doing something to help. So why don't you take a look at this video?
I just don't get it. Seems like nothing's getting better in this world, but I post really eye-opening stuff every day.
I know, you do. I do too.
BT Dubs, I just retweeted that article you shared.
Which one?
I think it had a picture of a baby panda in it.
Thank you.
Feels like you're doing everything you can to help the world, huh?
Yeah.
Well, now there's a way to do more. It's called actually doing something.
You mean responding to commenters?
No, that's not actually doing anything.
No, he means being an ally and changing your profile picture.
No, I don't.
Oh, you mean unfriending people I disagree with?
No.
Oh, you mean taking an online poll? I'm doing that right now. Undecided.
No, that's not
What
what
are you talking about then?
I'm talking about. You're not even listening.
I'm sorry. I'm signing this online petition, and that's actually doing some things.
Not exactly, no. That's not.
So is this a hashtag thing, or is there an app for this?
What? No! You just have to actually do something.
So maybe today as you leave church, just know that if you post it on social media, it doesn't mean that you actually did anything. You have 4 friends, half of them don't agree with you. It'll just turn into a debate. And since when has anyone's mind ever been changed from a debate on social media? But how different would the world look? How different would Rockford look if when we saw something that we couldn't run away from, that instead of just talking about it, there's this phrase that gets floated around called talkivist. It's like we talk about something so much we actually think we did something, but instead of being a talkivist, we actually were an activist. We actually did something to change it. How different do you think our communities would look, our schools would look, our family groups, whatever, if we really decided to let it do something inside of us and then come out of us? Well, there's a guy in the Bible who actually did just that, and his name is Nehemiah. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at the life of Nehemiah, and we're going to get some blueprints from God on how to actually do something when we feel stirred. And so we're going to dive in, Nehemiah chapter 1, starting with verse 1. These are the memoirs of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In late autumn, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was at the fortress of Susa. Hanani, one of my brothers, came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah. I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and about how things were going in Jerusalem. They said to me, things are not going well for those who returned to the province of Judah. They are in great trouble and disgrace. The walls of Jerusalem have been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. So let's pause here for a second. Let's get a little context, a little history as to what's happening right now. The year is 444 BC. It's the fall in Susa. Some of you are like, where is Susa? Susa is modern day Iran. They have lovely autumns in Iran. Said no one ever, okay? And so Nehemiah is now at the fortress of King Artaxerxes. He is the Persian king. He is a Jewish man. We don't know how old he is here at this point in time. And you would say, what's a Jewish man doing at the fortress of a Persian king? Well, they are now the Jewish people under Persian rule. And it says later on in the narrative that he is the cupbearer for the king. And essentially what the cupbearer would do for the king is it was his job to pick and taste wines to give to the king. So he's like an ancient sommelier. Now, some of you are like, sweet, that's the job for me, right? I would love to be the guy or the person who gets to pick and taste wines for the king. One little problem with this job at this point in history, people like to kill kings. And one of the ways that they would kill kings is they would poison the kings. So the reason the king had a cupbearer in the first place is it was their job to taste the wine to make sure there wasn't any poison in it. So if you had this job, you better have a good life insurance policy, right? There's no hazard pay that comes along with this job because the box wine could literally put you in a box, all right? So it's a tough job. Now, Nehemiah's brother, it says in this narrative, he gets back from traveling from Judah. And he's curious about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital city of Judah. Now, to the Jews, Jerusalem is a holy place. It's a sacred place. This is the motherland. This is their homeland. It's the place of their ancestors. And it's a symbol to them of their faith and to God in their lives. And at this point in human history, 150 years have now passed since the Babylonians came in and they took over Judah. They took over Jerusalem. The Babylonians completely destroyed the city. All right. Now, over this point of history, the Persians come in, they take over the Babylonians, and so now, by proxy, the Jews are under Persian rule. The Persians, though, are a little bit nicer to the Jewish people than the Babylonians, and so they allow a remnant of them to go back to Judah, to go back to Jerusalem, and to rebuild their city. And so if you were here a couple months ago, we did a series called It's Time on the book of Haggai, and we talked about how the Jews went back and rebuilt their homes and then rebuilt the temple. So now in Nehemiah, this is years after they had gone back now to Jerusalem. They've already started to rebuild parts of the city. But as Nehemiah finds out by asking his brother, he finds out the city is no bueno. Things are not going well still in Jerusalem. The affairs are not in order. Things are not going well because there are no walls in the city. So that makes Jerusalem a laughingstock. It makes it a sham city. Because there's no protection. There's nothing in the city that they're protecting. The people don't care about what's happening within the city. So it's a disgrace. It becomes a laughingstock to the other people, other cities, other communities, other faith groups, other nationalities in the world because they don't have these basic protections because any ancient city that was of note at this point in history had a wall around it. It would be parallel to us in this day and age. Any city of note has a fire department, right? It has a police department because it says that the city, the people in the city are worth protecting. And so in the same way, they don't have this, and so they're ashamed of who they are. They're ashamed of their homeland. They don't have any pride. They don't have any identity. It seems like there's nothing in the city that people think is worth protecting. Another way of looking at this is in the War of 1812, I don't know if you know this, little history lesson, the British actually invaded Washington, D.C. And when the British invaded Washington, D.C., they actually burned down the Capitol, they burned down the White House. Well, what if, hundreds of years later, instead of rebuilding the White House and rebuilding the Capitol, we just left it kind of burned, ruins, nothing, right? We didn't go back, we didn't rebuild it. Well, that would be a black eye, right, on our country. That would be a black eye on our nationalism, on our pride. And this is essentially what the Jewish people feel when they think about Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah, he hears this sad news, and I want you to see what he does, verse 4. When I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. So Nehemiah, he hears this sad news, and it bothers him so much that he gets weak in the knees. He has to sit down. He has to gather himself. He has to collect himself, and he just starts to weep. He starts to cry. Now, this isn't like a 5-minute cry. He's like, okay, I'm good. And he pulls himself together. No. The narrative says he cries for days. This guy's a mess, right? This guy, he can't get it together at all. He can't turn a blind eye to this. He can't ignore this, right? He just is crying over and over and over and over again. And right here, we see the first step that is a painful but necessary step to actually doing something. And many times, God's blueprints to doing something starts when you have a broken heart. It starts when you have a broken heart. Now, the reality is in this world, there's pain and tragedy all over the place, right? And how often do you hear about some of the pain and tragedy of this world? You might hear about, oh, there's kids starving over in another country, and you're like, oh, that's so sad that those kids are starving. Where do you want to go out to dinner tonight? Should we go to Lucha? Should we go to Ciao Bella? Like, right, where are we going? Like, what? Where are we hanging? And it's like it kind of goes in one ear one and out the other. And it doesn't make us bad people. It just didn't break their heart. But then there are other things that we hear. Maybe, once again, I talked about this up top, because it's connected to us. Maybe a friend, a family member, somebody in our church, somebody in our small group. And we hear it, or we hear about something that's happening in the world, and we can't shake it. Because it breaks our heart. It does something deep down inside of us that starts to mess with us. And we try to ignore it, we can't. We try to shake it off, we can't, because something's happening deep down on the inside. It hits home, it feels personal, it grips you, and you're like, I can't run from this one. I can't turn away from this one. I got to do something about this. Because here's why. When your pain intersects with your passion, this is when you can begin to find your purpose. Guys, that's good. When your pain intersects with your passion, you can find your purpose. And guys, I've seen something that I just simply can't take anymore. I've experienced something that has literally broken my heart too many times over that I have to now do something. And so effective immediately, I'm resigning from the church to become the quarterback for the Chicago Bears. I can't possibly be any worse. So I had some of you going there for a second, didn't I? Gosh, they're hard to be a Bears fan. I went from thinking we were going to win the Super Bowl and never lose a game to now I'm like, if they win a game, I'll be shocked. We love and hate our team hard, don't we? Oh, well. All right, back to Nehemiah. So Nehemiah lives literally. If you look at where he's at, Susa, compared to Jerusalem, it's like over 1,000 miles from this city. He hears about something that's happening 1,000 miles away. We don't think he's ever even been to this city. Most historians don't think he'd ever been. But he can't brush it off. He can't ignore it. He can't say out of sight, out of mind. And here's why. God put a burden on his heart. And when God puts a burden on your heart, you can try to shake it. You can try to run from it. You can try to ignore it. But it's deep now. It's burned inside of you. And you've got to do something. And I've seen this with so many people. You'll hear about people who actually do care about orphans on the other side of the world, and you think, why do they care? Well, because God gave them a burden. God put something on their heart, and they can't turn a blind eye to it. They just can't ignore it. And you see, our opportunity for impact comes when something impacts us, right? When something really impacts us, we see an opportunity then to impact the world around us. That's why pain plus our passion turns into purpose. You know, years ago, I was at a Christian leadership conference, and they brought up a young man, 9-year-old young man. His name was Austin Gutwine. And he comes up, and he starts talking about how he had heard about orphans that were basically being orphaned because their parents were dying of the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And he sat there as a 9-year-old kid, and he thought, that's so sad. that I couldn't imagine losing my parents to a disease and then being an orphan and then not knowing what to do. And so he said, I've got to do something. It caused him pain. Yes, he lived thousands of miles away. Yes, he had never been to Africa. But for some reason, it did something inside of him and caused him this pain. And then he said, okay, what am I passionate about? Well, I like basketball. I'm a 9-year-old kid. I like to shoot hoops. So he's like, okay, what if I can take my pain? What if I can mix it together with my passion and come up with a purpose? And so that year, the very first year, he started an organization called Hoops of Hope. And it was just a one-man organization. It was him shooting hoops on World AIDS Day to bring awareness to the orphan epidemic and the AIDS crisis that's happening over in Africa. Now, fast forward years later, he's raised over $4 million. They've built schools, they've built orphanages, they've built clinics. They've made this huge impact because one 9-year-old kid couldn't turn a blind eye to some pain that he saw on the other side of this world, was just naive and crazy enough to think he could mix it with his passion and then turn it into a purpose to be leveraged for God's glory. And that's how it works, is that when our pain gets mixed together with our passion, purpose comes forth. Yeah, I had a meeting this week with a couple, and I always love meeting with new people to the church, and they had some questions just about the church, and this isn't abnormal. This happens periodically from time to time. And one of the questions they asked that I do get asked periodically is, why did I start State Line? Like, why did State Line get started? And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the simple answer is that State Line for me is a mixture of pain and passion for a purpose. And you say, well, what do you mean by that, Greg? You know, all throughout my life, as I've been involved with church ministry, I would hear stories who maybe grew up in a certain denomination or a certain religion or maybe served in a certain church, and they would just have terrible experiences. Maybe they were involved in church at a young age, and then something happened, and they kind of walked away from the church or even walked away from Jesus, and maybe they felt used, maybe they felt taken advantage of, maybe they didn't feel cared for, whatever. And every time I hear that, it breaks my heart. I hate hearing that. And now my passion is the local church. I mean, ultimately my passion is Jesus, but Jesus' vehicle to reach people on this planet is the local church. So I'm like, man, people are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't want them to lose their love for Jesus because of a hurt that happened. So what if we could start a church that kept Jesus as the focal point? What if we could start a church that just redirected everyone to look at Christ? Because yes, we're a mess. Yes, we're not perfect. Yes, we're going to let people down, but we can point them to a perfect Jesus. And if we keep Jesus the center of what we do, then even when we do make mistakes, we can redirect and refocus. And so out of pain and passion came a purpose to start State Line, to be a church that just keeps pointing people back to Jesus. And that's why we say all of the time here, we're a Jesus church. We love Jesus. We talk about Jesus. We brag about Jesus. You don't need to be connected to me. You don't need to be connected to Tyler. Be connected to Jesus. He's awesome. He's the one thing that you need. He'll change everything about your life because Jesus is amazing. And so that's what we do. And so out of that, we're thinking, okay, we want people to be introduced to the love of Jesus, not to religion, right? Not to following a set of rules or anything like that. We want people to know who the God and person of Jesus, like who he is, and fall in love with him, people who are lost from him. And then for those who have been burned by the church before, for those who have been hurt, I want them to rediscover Jesus, not rediscover church, to fall in love with Jesus again. And here we are, and that's what we're trying to do. And so when a broken heart comes, a lot of times a broken heart, it may point to a purpose. And you say, okay, yeah, I need to do that. But just because a broken heart may point you towards a purpose, it doesn't mean it'll point you to a plan, right? It doesn't mean you have the action steps all of a sudden to tell you how to get about fixing that broken heart or remedying the situation. So like, what do you do when you want to do something and you don't know how? Well, look at what Nehemiah did. Back half of verse 4, we're going to look at it again. For days, I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. You see, when you feel that tug on your heart, when you feel that thing that breaks your heart, that grips you, and you don't know what to do, that's always a sign that it's time to pray. Whenever you have a broken heart, it's always an indicator that now it's a time to pray. And here's what happens. God's blueprints take shape when you pray the problem. God's blueprints take shape when you pray the problem. Now think about Nehemiah here for a second. He's a cupbearer, all right? Now this may be considered an honored position in a royal court, right? He may have a cush room, a lavish house. He may have a nice place to hang out. But make no mistake, he's a glorified butler. So what qualifies a butler to do anything to fix a city thousands of miles away that he's never even been to before? We don't know if he's ever even explored a city. He didn't have an engineering degree, right? He didn't own a construction company. He didn't have a bunch of people at his command. He didn't hold any type of political office. The only tool that we know of that he was skilled at using was a wine opener. And yet, here we have this everyday, ordinary guy who's completely unqualified to do anything to help this city that he had never been to. But over the course of 52 days, I'm letting the cat out of the bag here, so go and read Nehemiah. All right, read it. That's your homework. Go ahead and read it. But here's what happens. Over 52 days, this cupbearer rebuilds the walls around Jerusalem. Something the people couldn't figure out how to do over 150 years. A guy comes from 1,000 miles away who has no experience, no skill necessarily, who is just an amazing leader / motivator, and in 52 days, they happen to rebuild this wall. This gives a whole new meaning to this famous church phrase that says, God doesn't call the qualified, but qualified the called, right? Well, how does God do that? How does God qualify the called? Through prayer. Through prayer. That's God's process. That's God's beginning point to qualifying us to do the things that he's asked us to do. And if you read the narrative of Nehemiah, you see 12 different recorded instances where he prays. 12. So how many more times did he pray and it wasn't recorded? He just made prayer his pattern. When he needed peace, he'd pray. When he needed a plan, he'd pray. When he needed a solution, he'd pray. When he needed favor, he'd pray. When he needed to figure out what to do, he'd pray. Prayer was his modus operandi. And so the reality is ordinary, everyday people can become extraordinary when they pray to an extraordinary God. They can do amazing things when you leverage the power of God and unleash the power of God in your life through prayer. You see, prayer will equip you. It opens doors for you. It gives you favor. Prayer, when you begin to make a pattern of prayer be a pattern of your life, you see the world through a different lens. You can't help but see the world through God's eyes. So you begin to get God's ideas. You begin to get God's ways on how to see the problems versus seeing other things that are happening. You see his way of interjecting into the world because God doesn't want to give you a burden and then leave you high and dry to figure it out on your own. He wants to help you. And so we see as Nehemiah is praying, he actually prays a very simple but significant prayer. We're going to take a look at it, verse 11. He says, "O Lord, please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those of us who delight in honoring you." He's just saying, God, my heart is for you. It's for your kingdom. I want to do things well. I want to do things right. I want to honor you. And he says, please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it into his heart to be kind to me. You see, Nehemiah realizes through the power of prayer and the pattern of prayer that yes, maybe he's a cupbearer, but he's a cupbearer to the king, which means every single day he has a platform with the most powerful person in his immediate world. Every single day, especially if the man likes his vino, right? Every single day he has a platform with the king, which means God had perfectly positioned Nehemiah to be with the one person who could actually help him fix the problem that broke his heart. God had perfectly positioned him. And so many times when we look at our own life, we look in the mirror and we're like, who am I to help? Who am I to make a difference? What skills do I have to get after this problem? What resources do I have? Who am I? All right, what if a 9-year-old kid, Austin, was like, who am I? I'm 9 years old. What can I do to help? And so we say things like, well, I'm just a 9-year-old kid. I'm just a mom. I'm just a line worker. I'm just a physician. I'm just a retail sales associate. I'm just a mechanic. And we have this, I'm a justa. No. You are not just anything. Here's what you are. Through Christ, you are a child of God with a passion, with a calling, and with a purpose. And God can take the ordinary and do something extraordinary when you surrender your life to him. So there is no justa. And as a matter of fact, God may have you perfectly positioned where you're at, with who you're at, to make the biggest impact beyond what you even thought was possible. You have no idea the resources of the people or where God has you, why he has you where you're at. You are in places and can go to places that I could never go to. Tyler can't go to those places, right? You may go to a Tuesday morning moms group. If I walked into the Tuesday morning moms group, they'd think I was a creeper, right? I can't do that. You have a ticket to go. And who knows what could come out of those relationships, right? I can't walk into Collins Aerospace on Wednesday. I'd get tased in the neck. I don't have access to go there, but you do. You can go to the places, wherever God has you. You are perfectly positioned. And so don't limit God's power that can be unleashed in your life with where you're at. And this all happens through the power of prayer. Seeing the world and your everyday through God's eyes, not your own. And you will unlock God's perspective into your world when you invite him into your world through prayer. And I'll say this, there is so much power in prayer, you better be careful what you pray for. Because if you do have a broken heart and you do want to do something and you start praying about it, God may open up doors and give you favor and give you opportunity to do something about it. But just because God gives you an opportunity to do something doesn't mean it's going to be easy when the time comes to act. And so Nehemiah, he prayed for an opportunity to talk to the king. So let's look at what happened. Chapter 2, verse 1. Early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. So the king asked me, "Why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled." Then I was terrified. I highlighted that word for a reason. We'll come back to this. But I replied, "Long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire." The king asked, "Well, how can I help you?" Once again, highlighted this for a reason. With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, "If it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried." Now, I want you to notice that the verse we read earlier in chapter 1, this verse that we're reading here, they're both time-stamped. So in the autumn, and now we fast forward 4 months, it says the following spring, he's now in the presence of the king, which means his heart has been broken for his city for the last 4 months. 4 months he's been praying. 4 months he's been sitting on this broken heart, which tells me you can't rush God's plans. Sometimes it takes time before God will begin to materialize the plan or the opportunity. And so if you try to get in front of God, that's when bad things start to happen. We're always best to go to God first in prayer and then see and wait for God to open up opportunities or put opportunities in front of us. And you'd say, okay, well, that makes sense, but why didn't Nehemiah, if his heart was that broken, why didn't he just say something to the king? He sees him every day, right? Isn't that the opportunity in and of itself? Why didn't he just ask the king? Why didn't he just say something to him? Well, in this culture, here's what you have to understand, and this kind of points back to why he was terrified. If you came before a king and made a request to a king and you weren't asked and you weren't invited, you could be executed. He could just say, "I don't like you right now," dead, right? Gone, game over for you. And so he had to pick his moment and pick his opportunity very carefully because he knew, I prayed for favor with the king. And God's going to act, and God's going to give me favor, so I'm going to wait for God to open the door. And so then, when the time is right, when God does move, when God opens the door, God's blueprints may require you to take a risk. God's blueprints may require you to take a risk. It's risky to ask the king to be a trusted cupbearer, to be able to take off and leave. And so as he's talking to the king, though, as he steps into his presence, the king, he notices something's wrong with Nehemiah, right? He says, "What's wrong with your face?" My wife says this to me every day. "What's wrong with your face?" "I don't know, babe. It's just the way God made me," okay? He's terrified. King doesn't like his request. He could still kill him. He could still off him right there on the spot. Kings don't like sad people in their presence. It's why they had jesters. So don't be Debbie Downer coming in here, right? I'll kill you, right? Don't do that. You better come in smiling. So he's scared. But here's the thing. People who do something are people who are more afraid of doing nothing than taking a risk. And he didn't want to be defined for being scared or not taking a risk. And so he's prayed up. He's been praying for 4 months. He's ready. He's got his plans in order. And instead of coming out with the problem right away, this just shows a little bit about the savviness and the wisdom of Nehemiah. He pours a little honey in the king's ear. He says, "Long live the king. You look great. I love your hair. Is that a Gucci robe?" Right? He's just buttering him up a little bit. It's always a good idea to butter up the boss. All right? Then he tells the king about his broken heart. King asks him, "What's wrong?" He says, "Well, my city, my people, my homeland, the city where my ancestors are buried, it's in ruins, it's in tatters, we're a disgrace." He asks, "How can I help?" And then once again, something else interesting happens here in this narrative. It says he throws up a prayer to heaven before he responds. Now, he doesn't probably stop and pray out loud right before the king. This is something that happens in his heart. You know, in the New Testament, the Bible tells us to pray without ceasing. You know, so often when we think about prayer, we think that we've got to get into a closet for 4 hours a day like a monk, cover our head with a shawl, right, and have this like dedicated long prayer time for our prayer life to be significant. But the life that God is actually inviting you into is a relational one. And he wants you to pray without ceasing. What does that mean? He wants you to throw up fire prayers, shoot off prayers every now and then. He just wants you to be in constant dialogue with him. As you're about to walk into that meeting, fire off a prayer. As you jump in the car, fire off a prayer. As you drop the kids off to school, you fire off a prayer. This is the relationship and the life that God is inviting you into. And you see that modeled right here in Nehemiah. And this is because God is everywhere. And he's with you wherever you go. He wants to be in your everyday, ordinary, mundane. And so he answers the king as the king answers what's wrong. He then tells him what's wrong. King says, "How can I help?" He says, "King, can I go to the motherland? Can I go home? Can I go to Jerusalem to fix my city?" Now, at this point, he's at the mercy of the king. He's made his request known, and this is like Gladiator. He can go thumbs up or thumbs down. He can do what he wants to do, but the king hears his request, and he tells him he can go. And if you read the rest of the narrative, this is great. As soon as the king tells him he can go, he is ready. He has an entire list of blueprints, battle plans. He has all these requests that he makes to the king. He's just like, "Okay, I can go. Here's all my requests." This is like Cousin Eddie, by the way. If you remember Christmas Vacation, when he's shopping with Clark, and Clark says to him, like, "Hey, I noticed you probably don't have a ton of money. We'd like to do something for you and the kids this Christmas. We'd like to buy you gifts." And he's like, "No, Clark, can't do that. No, I couldn't." He's like, "No, I insist. Let me buy you guys some gifts." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And then he gives him the list. He's just ready to go. "Here's my list. Get yourself something, Clark, something real nice," right? He just gives him this whole list. Well, this is Nehemiah. Nehemiah knows, because he's been prayed up, the king's going to say yes, and he better be ready with his plans and with his list. And so he just goes on. He's like, "Here, I need a list, or I need a letter to all the governors. I need you to tell them to give me favor. I need you to tell them to give me safe passage through this area. I need a letter to the king's leader of the king's forest so I can get a bunch of wood to build this, the gates," all this stuff. He's just like listing it all out and just lets it rip. And it's hilarious that he does all of this. And look at verse 8. It says, "And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me." So why did the king give so much favor to Nehemiah? Well, God's hand was on him. God had blessed him. God had equipped him to do the thing that he asked him to do, the thing that was giving him a burden. And not only does the king grant these requests, it literally says he gives him his army to escort him back to Jerusalem. The king sends his army with them. And in the same way, when God's hand is on you, when you have a holy anger, a righteous indignation, when you feel stirred by God, you have a broken heart, and you know you have to act and do something, and you know it's from God, God's hand's with you. And if God's hand is with you, you don't have to be afraid. God will open the doors. God will make a way where it seems like there is no way. God will lead you and guide you every step of the way. Isaiah 41:10 says, "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." So as we get ready to close this morning, let me ask you again a similar question to what I asked up top. What really messes with you? What really bothers you? What's something that you see that you're like, "I can't run from this anymore"? What's your holy anger? What's your righteous indignation? What's that thing where your pain and your passion are intersecting to create purpose? And are you willing to run towards it? here's what I know about you that you may not even know about yourself. Because of the Imago Dei, we say that term around here, it just means image of God. You were created in God's image, which means because God is a purposeful God, a God of meaning, you were created to have purpose and meaning with your life. Your life is not just about what you consume or what you take from this world. If you live that type of existence, it is a shallow existence. It will leave you wanting. You were put on this planet to make a difference with your life. You were put on this planet to have an impact. This is why when Jesus ascended to heaven, right before he did so after the resurrection, he could have given his disciples any type of motivational speech. He could have given them a poem. He could have given them a pep talk. He gives them a command. Go and do. Go into this world and make disciples. God gave us a mission. He gave us action steps because he knew our life would be culminated not just in our relationship with him, but then when we let what God has done in us come out of us into this world and to make an impact in the world around us. Because God's plan to change the world is Christ in us, us in the world. That's God's plan. It's always been through people. And that's why Galatians 6:2-3 says this: share each other's burdens, have a broken heart for each other, and in this way obey the law of Christ. If you think you are too important to help someone, you are only fooling yourself. You are not that important. Okay, Paul, right? 1 John 3:18. Dear children, let's not merely say that we love each other. Let's not be talkacists. Let's show the truth by our actions. Let's be activists. Let's do something with our broken heart. And so we should be okay. And many of us, maybe this morning, we should begin to pray for a broken heart. That's kind of countercultural to what we would normally talk about at church, right? Normally we would say, God, heal my broken heart. No, today we're going to pray for God to break your heart. For God to break your heart for what breaks his, to see the world through his eyes so that you can be a part of the solution, so you can go and make a difference in the world around you, so that you can have an impact. And you know what's crazy? When God begins to break your heart for something, and when you start to get passionate about something, you get mad that other people aren't passionate about what you're passionate about. You're like, I don't get it. Why don't other people care about addiction issues? Why don't other people care about teen pregnancy? Why don't other people care about women being sold into sex slavery? Why does anyone else care? And it's not that they don't care. God just gave that burden to you. That's your burden. That means God wants you to do something with that. And somebody else has a burden for something different. And we always say, well, let's change the world. No, don't change the world. Change the one thing that God gave you a burden for. And if everyone changes the one thing they have a burden for, then collectively, through Jesus, we'll change the world. It'll be a completely different place. One of the guys that goes to our church here, some of you may know who he is. He's a worship leader and a missionary. His name's Lennox Barnett. And Lennox, he travels now all across the globe, and he shares his story about what God has done in his life. And a lot of times, Lennox will just come into my office, and he'll just interrupt me. He never makes an appointment, by the way. So if you're here, Lennox, shame on you. I love you. He'll just walk in, and I'm working or I'm doing something, and he just starts talking. Greg, I'm going to Honduras, or Greg, I just got back from Africa. Greg, I'm doing this. Greg, I'm doing that. And as he's talking, I push all my stuff aside, and I just listen. So much passion comes out of him for what he does. And he's like, Greg, you know me, I was an orphan kid in Jamaica, and I was blind, and I thought I was forgotten, and then these people from the States came over, and they shared their love with me, and they invited me into their homes, and they told me about Jesus, and now I have to go into these countries. I got to tell other people about the love of Jesus. I just have to go and play music for them. I got to go and bring them toiletries. I got to go and bring them stuff. I just have to. I can't not go. And I'm like, what do you need? I'll take my iPad, right? It's like, what do you need, Lennox? I'll help you. Because you realize he has this, out of his pain and this passion, he has this purpose. And I want that for every single one of you. I want you to be consumed by something, and it starts with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It starts with just being so in love with Jesus, knowing what he did for you on the cross, accepting what he did for you on the cross, and then wanting to share that with other people. It always starts there. And I just so badly want State Line to be a church of people that actually do something. So what if you're the something that God wants to do? What if you're the someone that God wants to bring. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I pray right now in this moment you begin to break our heart for what breaks yours. I pray you speak to us and give us a sense of what it is that you're asking each person in this room to do to fulfill your mission on this planet. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.